Nausea hit so hard I had to grab the door handle just to keep myself upright. That's what pregnancy does to you at 8 weeks. It doesn't ask permission. It just takes over your body like it owns the place. Which I suppose it does. We were on the 401, somewhere between Kingston and Trenton, when I made my husband pull over. I didn't ask nicely. I couldn't. My mouth was already filling with saliva the way it does right before everything goes wrong, and I just said stop the car, and he did. And I got out and crouched on the gravel shoulder while the transport trucks blew past close enough to rattle my teeth. My mother-in-law was in the back seat. She'd been quiet for most of the drive from Toronto, which should have told me something. She's never quiet. She has opinions about highway on-ramps. I don't know how long I was outside. Long enough that the cold March air actually helped. Long enough that I thought, okay, this is manageable. I can get back in the car. We can keep driving to the family reunion in Belleville. I can survive this weekend. I straightened up, wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, turned around. The car was gone. I stood there on the shoulder of the 401 and watched the taillights of my own husband's car disappear into traffic. I watched them until I couldn't see them anymore. Then I looked down at the gravel. Then I looked at the empty stretch of highway in both directions. A Tim Hortons cup blew past my foot. My phone was in my purse. My purse was in the car. I was 31 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, standing on the side of a major highway in March with no coat because I'd left it on the back seat, wearing a cardigan that did absolutely nothing against the wind coming off Lake Ontario. My husband had driven away while I was vomiting into a ditch. I want you to understand that I didn't cry right away. I think I was too confused to cry. Your brain does this thing where it keeps trying to generate explanations that make the situation normal. He probably just pulled ahead to the rest stop. He's probably just around the bend. There's probably some reason that makes this okay. And you cycle through those explanations until you run out of them, and then you stand there in the wind and the reality of it settles into your chest like something cold and heavy. He didn't pull ahead. He drove away. A woman in a minivan stopped about 10 minutes later. She had a car seat in the back with a toddler asleep in it and a coffee in the cuff holder. And she looked at me standing there in my cardigan and said, "Oh, honey, the way you say it when you already know the story isn't good." She let me use her phone. I called my husband. He picked up on the second ring. "You left me on the highway," I said. There was a pause. Then, "Mom needed to get to Belleville. We couldn't just sit there." "I was sick. I'm pregnant. You left me on the side of the 401. Another pause. Then my mother-in-law's voice in the background. I could hear her clearly, saying she's always dramatic, she'll figure it out. He said he'd come back for me. He didn't. The woman in the minivan, her name was Patrice, and I will never forget her, drove me to the next exit and waited with me at the Tim Hortons there for 45 minutes until I could figure out what to do. She bought me a tea. She didn't ask questions. She just sat across from me and let me collect myself, which is the kindest thing a stranger has ever done for me. I used her phone to call my best friend, Joanna, who is a paralegal in Ottawa. Not a lawyer. I know, the trope. But she knows enough to be dangerous. And more importantly, she answered on the first ring and she didn't say, "Are you sure?" Or maybe he didn't mean it the way some people do when you tell them something awful. She just said, "Okay, where are you exactly?" and started looking up options. The first option was a cab to the Belleville train station, $70, which Joanna transferred to me through Patrice's phone number because that's the kind of person Joanna is. The second option was a Via Rail train back to Toronto Union, which left at 4:47 and cost $62 more. Joanna covered that too. She said we'd settle it later, but I knew she meant she was just giving it to me. I made it onto that train with 4 minutes to spare. I sat in a window seat and watched the flat Ontario landscape go by, and I thought about the fact that my coat was still in my husband's car, my phone was still in my husband's car, my overnight bag with my prenatal vitamins and my good shampoo and the novel I'd been reading was still in my husband's car, and my husband was 45 minutes away eating his aunt's potato salad at a family reunion that I'd been helping plan since January. I'd made the centerpieces, little mason jars with dried wildflowers. I'd ordered them from an Etsy seller in Guelph. Joanna picked me up at Union. She took one look at my face and didn't say anything, just handed me her spare jacket from the back seat and drove me to my house, our house, the one my husband and I had bought together 2 years ago, a semi-detached in Leslieville that we'd spent 3 months renovating, and sat with me in the kitchen while I tried to figure out what I was doing. What I was doing, it turned out, was deciding. I'd been married for 4 years. I'd been unhappy for about 2.5 of them, which is the part I hadn't said out loud to anyone, including Joanna. There had been smaller things before this. The Christmas when his mother rearranged my kitchen and he told me I was overreacting. The time I was in the hospital for a minor procedure and he forgot to pick me up because he'd made golf plans. The slow erosion of small considerations that you keep forgiving until you realize you've been forgiving them continuously for years, and nothing has changed. I'd gotten pregnant because I thought a baby might shift something, which is a terrible reason to get pregnant, and I knew it even while I was hoping it, and I'd been carrying that guilt around underneath all the morning sickness for 8 weeks. Joanna sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight." I said, "I think I already have." She nodded. She didn't argue. She'd been watching this happen from a distance for 2 years, and she had the grace not to say she'd seen it coming. We ordered pho from the place on Queen Street. I ate half of mine and felt almost human. Then I went upstairs, took a shower in my own bathroom, put on my own pajamas, and went to sleep in my own bed. My husband came home at 11:30 that night. I heard the garage door, heard him come through the kitchen, heard him stop when he saw the light under the bedroom door. He knocked. "I can explain," he said through the door. "You can explain tomorrow," I said. "I'm asleep." "Vivian." I didn't answer. I wasn't asleep, but I wasn't ready to talk. And I'd learned by then that having a conversation when you're not ready is how you end up saying things you don't mean, and accepting things you shouldn't. I lay there in the dark and listened to him stand outside the door for a while, and then I heard him go down the hall to the guest room, and then the house was quiet. He tried again in the morning. I was in the kitchen making toast. My appetite was cooperating for once, and he came downstairs in his University of Waterloo sweatshirt looking like he hadn't slept well, which I didn't feel particularly sorry about. He said his mother had been anxious about being late. He said he'd thought I could call a cab. He said he'd texted me, which would have been useful if my phone hadn't been in his car. He said he was sorry, in the tone of someone who expects the apology to function as a reset button, which it had in the past. It had always worked before. He'd say sorry, and I'd say it's okay, and we'd move on, and the ledger of small wrongs would get another entry, and I'd carry it. I buttered my toast. He said, "So are we okay?" I said, "I called a family lawyer yesterday afternoon." The way his face changed. I've thought about that moment a lot since. It wasn't shock exactly. It was more like recognition. Like some part of him had been waiting for this and couldn't pretend to be surprised, even though another part of him clearly wanted to. He said, "Vivian, that's insane. Over one fight?" I said, "Her name is Patricia O.C. and her office is on Bay Street. She was very helpful." That was true. After Joanna and I finished our pho, I'd asked Joanna to recommend someone, and she'd given me Patricia's number, and I'd called and left a message, and Patricia had called back within the hour, which I still find remarkable about Bay Street lawyers on a Saturday afternoon. We'd had a 40-minute conversation. I knew exactly where I stood. In Ontario, because we'd been married for 4 years, I was entitled to equalization of net family property, which meant the increase in value of our shared assets during the marriage would be split evenly. The house had appreciated significantly. Leslieville had done what Leslieville does, and a portion of the equity was mine regardless of whose name was on the mortgage. I also had rights regarding the pregnancy that I won't go into here except to say that Patricia made sure I understood all of them. My husband sat down at the kitchen table. He looked like the floor had tilted slightly. He said, "You talked to a lawyer before you even talked to me?" I said, "You drove away while I was sick on the side of the highway and then didn't come back." He said, "My mother." I said, "Your mother is 63 years old and drove herself everywhere for 40 years before we started offering to take her places. She was fine." Silence. He said, "What do you want?" That was a better question than I'd expected from him. I told him what I wanted. I wanted him out of the house for 30 days while I figured out next steps. I wanted access to our joint account, which I'd had all along but wanted to confirm he understood I wasn't going to be cut off from. I wanted the name and number of his benefits provider because I was still on his work plan and I needed to know my coverage for prenatal care. And I wanted him to tell his mother, in whatever words he chose, that I was not going to be discussing this with her, and that any attempt on her part to contact me or involve herself was going to make everything more complicated for everyone. He started to argue. He said the house was his too, which was true. He said 30 days was unreasonable. He said I was being vindictive. I said I stood on the 401 in March without a coat. You didn't come back. If you want to argue about unreasonable, we can do that with Patricia present. He left for his mother's condo in Etobicoke that afternoon. He took one bag. What he didn't know, what I hadn't told him yet because Patricia had advised me to gather documents before disclosing anything, was that I'd spent 2 hours that morning going through our files. We kept everything in a cabinet in the office, very organized, very me. Mortgage documents, investment account statements, a copy of his employment contract from when he'd started his current job 3 years ago, and something I'd half forgotten about, a TFSA in my name that I'd opened before we got married and continued contributing to without thinking much about it, with a current balance of just over $41,000. Premarital, meaning it wasn't subject to equalization, meaning it was entirely mine. Joanna had told me to forget about it until the divorce was finalized, just to let it sit. Good advice. The weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story of a woman leaving a bad marriage often gets told as a kind of liberation montage. She found herself, she thrived, the music swelled, and that's not what it felt like from the inside. What it felt like was exhaustion and nausea and a lot of nights eating crackers in bed and watching television I can't remember now. The morning sickness didn't care about my marital situation. It had its own schedule. My mother-in-law called 3 times. I didn't answer. On the third call, she left a voicemail that said, among other things, that I had always been difficult and that her son deserved better. I saved the voicemail. Patricia said it wasn't relevant to anything legally, but that it was useful to have it, in the way that truth is sometimes just useful to have. My husband called more than 3 times. Some of those conversations were hard. He cried once, which I hadn't expected. He said he loved me, which I believed, and that he didn't know how things had gotten this bad, which I also believed, and that he wanted to go to couples counseling, which was something he'd refused to consider for 2 years when I'd suggested it. And that fact sat between us on the phone like a piece of furniture neither of us wanted to move. I said I'd think about the counseling. I didn't go. By May, I was visibly pregnant, which made everything feel more real and also more complicated. I had an appointment with my OB in Toronto, and my mother came up from London to go with me, which was the first time in years that I'd let her come to something medical with me. And I cried in the waiting room for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, and she held my hand and didn't ask me to explain, which is what mothers do when they're being good at it. The ultrasound showed a healthy baby. That's what the technician said in exactly those words, a healthy baby. I watched the screen and felt something shift in my chest that wasn't grief or relief or happiness exactly, but was all 3 of them at once, and I thought, okay, this is the thing I'm doing. This is what comes next. My husband and I signed a separation agreement in September. It was managed, professional, nothing like what I'd feared when I'd first imagined it. The house sold in October. Leslieville had indeed done what Leslieville does, and my share of the equity, combined with the TFSA, meant I had enough to put a down payment on a small 2-bedroom condo in the East End, close enough to my sister that she could be there in 10 minutes. Close enough to a good park that I'd already started thinking about how we'd spend summer mornings. My daughter was born in November, I'm not going to tell you her name because some things belong only to the people they belong to. But she was healthy, she was loud, she arrived at 2:14 in the morning at St. Ville, Michael's hospital, and my mother was there and Joanna was there, and when the nurse put her on my chest and she stopped crying for just a second and looked at me. That specific look, like she was deciding whether to trust the world. I thought about the 401 in March, the gravel, the Tim Hortons cup blowing past my foot. I thought about how I'd stood there thinking, now what? It's funny, the moments that turn out to be the turning points, you expect them to feel more significant while they're happening. You expect a sign. What you get is a transport truck going by close enough to shake the ground under your feet, and then you make a decision about what to do next, and then you keep going. My husband sent a gift to the hospital, a stuffed bear, brown, with a small maple leaf on its paw. There was a card. I won't tell you what it said either. Some things are private. But I kept the bear. My daughter is 4 months old now, and she makes a sound like a question every time she sees the ceiling fan, and I've started to think that's a pretty reasonable response to a world that keeps spinning regardless of what you do. She's figuring it out. We both are. There was a moment, about 2 weeks after I came back to Toronto on the train, before the lawyer, before the separation agreement, before any of it was decided, when my mother-in-law left that voicemail. The one that said I'd always been difficult. I listened to it 3 times. The third time, something in me went very quiet, the way a room goes quiet after the last guest leaves. I picked up my phone and I sent my husband one text. Just one. It said, "I've spoken to a lawyer. Please do not have your mother contact me again." That was all. He read it. He didn't reply for 6 hours. When he did, it was 2 words, "Okay, understood." I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and finished making my tea. Joanna always says the most powerful thing you can do is respond to chaos with clarity. I didn't know what I was doing when I sent that text. I didn't feel powerful. I felt tired and pregnant and hollowed out and about 40% sure of anything. But I said exactly what needed to be said in exactly as many words as it required, and that turned out to be enough. It turned out, actually, to be everything. There's a version of this story where I get back in that car, where Patrice doesn't stop, or I decide it's too much trouble, or I tell myself it wasn't that bad. I've thought about that version a lot. It doesn't end well for me. What I know now, and I think I knew even standing on that gravel shoulder, even before I could name it, is that the things people do when they think there are no consequences are the truest things about them. My husband didn't drive away because he panicked. He drove away because, somewhere underneath everything, he had decided I would handle it. That I always handled it. That handling it was my job. That's not a single bad decision. That's a pattern of thought that had been running quietly for years, and the 401 in March was just the day it finally showed itself in a way I couldn't rationalize around. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because I think it matters to be honest about what we're actually looking at when we look at our own lives. Calling something a mistake when it's actually a pattern doesn't protect you. It just delays the moment when you have to deal with what's real. The thing that got me through those months wasn't anger, even though I had plenty of it. It was something quieter. It was paying attention. It was asking Joanna for a lawyer's number instead of a shoulder to cry on. It was reading the separation agreement 3 times before I signed it. It was understanding that grief and practicality can exist in the same week, that you can cry in a hospital waiting room and still know exactly what your TFSA balance is. I'd spent years deferring to other people's certainty because I wasn't sure enough of my own, learning to trust my own assessment of a situation, to gather information, think clearly, and act on what I actually knew rather than what I hoped. That was the shift that made everything else possible. And then there's the question of getting up, not in a motivational poster sense. I mean, literally, there were mornings during those months when getting up felt like an argument I had to win with myself before I'd even had coffee. The morning sickness, the uncertainty, the loneliness of a house that still smelled like someone else's life. None of that goes away because you made a good decision. The good decision just means you're facing it on your own terms instead of someone else's. You still have to do the work of getting through each day, which is unglamorous and repetitive and occasionally involves crackers and bad television, and you do it anyway. What I want to say to anyone who is somewhere in the middle of their own version of this is the clarity you're looking for doesn't always arrive before you have to act. Sometimes you act first, and the clarity comes after, on a Via Rail train watching flat Ontario go by, eating crackers, not entirely sure of anything. That's okay. What matters is that you acted according to what you actually believed was right, not what was convenient, not what was expected, not what would keep the peace for another 6 months. Vivian, I came out the other side, not undamaged, not without grief, but intact, which turned out to be what I needed most. My daughter makes a sound like a question when she sees the ceiling fan. I've started to think she has the right idea.